have had a child over 40 and we did it very well. And here's a bonus, little nugget. My last child, I birthed all by myself. I got into the hospital room. I knew that he was there. I told the nurse that he's here, so you need to call the doctor now. And she didn't believe me. And so by the time I got put into the bed, I pulled the sheet up and I tied the corners to the side of the bed rail. I did that last push. I pulled him up to my chest, wrapped the sheet around him, reached over to the diaper bag, took some pictures, called my husband and said, he's here, but there's no doctor. And when it was time for me to discharge out of the hospital, I said to the doctor and the nurses, take his name off of my baby's birth certificate because he was not here. Today, I am Dr. Sonia Lewis, and you will put my name here because I delivered this baby all by myself. And I share that story with people because we don't know to what, as mommies in particular, we don't know what that we don't know to the extent of our power and our ability to just kick in and do what we need to do. And so it reminds me of a lot of my maternal grandmother who was forced because of socials in society to have children at home and to help other women have children at home. So that's what it kind of reminded me of. And so I relish in that. I'm just like, I'm so super badass just for that.
We actually call our grandmother Nying, which is the Chinese word for grandmother on the father's side of the family.
I call him Grandpa Foot.
We, in our native language, in Hindi, we call them Dada and Dadi.
My other grandmother would be Maman Bozorg, which is Persian for grandmother.
Muchechu means old woman, thinking at Rwanda.
I called her Safta, which is a Hebrew word for grandma.
Everybody called her Mami Tita.
We called her Mima and Dede.
Grandma.
Hi, I'm Steph.
And I'm Robin. Welcome to Stories from Grandparents,
the podcast where we share stories about and from grandparents.
On this episode, we had a conversation with Sonia, who joined us from California. And it was an amazing conversation. It was 2 hours long, and we were able to pare it down, I think, to something really beautiful for this episode that touches on a lot of aspects of grandparenthood and also some issues we've never really delved into before on our podcast.
Yeah. What was interesting was that we talked about her experience with her own grandparents, but also she has a grandparent role herself. And on top of that, as you alluded to, we discussed some themes that we haven't really discussed on the podcast before around racism. And Sonia works in anti-racism and shared some stories and also some, tips on how to have difficult conversations with older relatives like our grandparents.
Can you tell us the dynamic of your family?
I am a woman who has birthed 6 beautiful boys into this world. And they range in age from 28 to 8. And they are like life. They are everything that I could have imagined and then some. And then my husband, who is 10 years my senior, married his high school sweetheart. They had children. And when I married him, he had 4 children. So they are my bonuses. They are definitely mine. I love them. They know that, look, I may not be your biological mother, but you know that you're going to get love and support from me. My oldest bonus child, her mother passed about 6-7 years ago. And her mom and I had a very open relationship. When she didn't feel like she can reach her, her children, get some understanding with them, she would call me and be like, hey, Sonia, can you talk to Tanisha? Hey, Sonia, can you talk to Kendall? Those kind of things. But she had, after she and my husband were divorced, she had 3 other children. And so she asked me when she was transcending and she was suffering with cancer and it was discovered too late and, all of the things. She asked me, she said, I know that you're going to take care of mine that, that are yours already because you've been doing that. but please, can you watch out for my other 3? So I said 6 plus 4, now plus 3. And then my older bonus children have blessed us with 3 grand girls, who I refuse to be called grandma. They call me Nana or Nani. And I remind them, as I, think I should, that your grandmother's name is Deborah, and we are going to make sure that her name lives, and she is important, and you should know who she is to you. But for right now, I am not anyone's grandma. That's the dynamic of our family. And I've been, happily married for over 25 years now. It's been a long time.
Because you currently have 13 people who see you as a mother.
Yeah.
Is that, do I got my math right?
So 6 plus 4 plus 3 plus 3, 16.
Okay. But then the last 3 are you're a Nana.
Are grands. Yeah. But
yeah.
we've raised 2 of the grands. So my
really? Okay.
my oldest grand, she was with us from like 6th grade to graduating high school. And my middle grand has been with us. She was with us from like 8 months until 3 years old. And she's been back with us from 3rd grade until the present. And she's in the 10th grade now.
Wow.
And we just were blessed this year with a pandemic baby, and she is 6 months. So yeah, we've raised 2 of those grands. They definitely, yeah.
That's so amazing.
Yeah.
That's so amazing. They're so lucky to have you.
I'm lucky to have them.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about your grandparents?
Absolutely. So both of my parents migrated to California from very different backgrounds, but I think for very similar reasons, just looking for an opportunity to escape what they saw as a very maligned and disenfranchised community that they grew up in. And my father's from very rural Texas, and my mother is from very urban Chicago. And so my mother knew that when she graduated high school, she didn't want to live any place where there was snow, and she would never, ever, ever in her entire life live in an apartment, because her family was forced out of their home due to the building of the freeway system, which was a really thriving Black community in Chicago. And the community was relegated to the projects. And so she equates apartments to projects. And so she came to California and left her entire family in Chicago on the Midwest and East Coast, Chicago, Baltimore, St. Louis area. And my dad, for very similar reasons, left Texas because he witnessed all of his siblings, or he heard that all of his siblings were born at home, because during the time he was birthed into the world, Black families could not have children in hospitals. And so, and he and his family were still working on tobacco and cotton plantations, or farms at that time. This is 1946, but that were former, lands. And so he said, I'm going to California. I have an older sister who's there, and we're just going to establish roots. And so when I came along, I didn't have neither of my parents had their parents with them, in California. And it was, as I got older, I remember my paternal grandfather coming to visit, and he was this very tall and handsome guy with wavy hair. And he always lifted me up and sat me on his shoulders. And so that's the image that I have of him. But to ask him a question about, Grandpa, what was life like when you were my age? Or, tell me how my mom was when she was my age. I had never had those kind of conversations. And he, eventually he passed away when I was in the 5th grade. And I can remember that we took a long drive because we couldn't afford plane tickets for our entire family to fly back to Chicago. We took this long drive from California. It was an adventure. My sister and I loved it. And then we got snowed in for 2.5, 3 weeks because it was the worst blizzard that hit Chicago in like forever, is what they tell us.
Oh,
and
wow.
we loved it. But my mom I saw every day that we woke up, my mom was being tortured. Like physically, it manifested all over her body. But those, are the only memories that I have were the occasional visits. I can remember when I was sharing with Stephanie, is that my my maternal grandmother ended up getting cancer when I was in high school. And she was, forced to come and live with us in California. And she didn't just have cancer, but she had dementia. And so she really didn't know us. And she would call us the names of all of her childhood friends or her childhood cousins. And we would just have to roll with the punches. So that kind of so again, she being on the East Coast. And then when she did come in and was around us, she was at a state of like not mental capacity to even be able to form that relationship. And so it was just like watching from a distance, but even though you're there. So those are kind of the things that I remember about them. I will say that my paternal grandmother, a lot of people in my father's family say that I am a lot like her. And so they say that I'm very wise or that I listen a lot and that I have her eyes. And I recently found out right before I became a doula that she was a doula. She was like the midwife of her town. And so I'm like, oh my gosh.
That's so cool.
Right?
Yeah.
I met with not a psychic, but someone who is in tune with the other side. And they said, your grandmother is always with you. And I just assumed that it was my maternal grandmother. And she was like, no, she has a male name. And I was like, a male name? Yeah, like a guy's name. And I was like, Willie? And she was like, yes, it's a W. And I was like, oh my. She was like, and you're going to do something to help people either transition into death or transition into life. And I was like, that's like a doula, right? And the lady confirmed this. And I was like, I just enrolled in a doula class.
No.
Like, this is freaking me out.
Yeah.
But that's all I know of them. That is literally all I know of them.
I love that story so much. I love like any stories of like,
that's
psychics
amazing.
or mediums and stuff. That's so cool. And also just confirmation that you're on the right track. Like how comforting.
Absolutely.
That you had just enrolled.
Yeah.
One thing that Sonia had shared with me, and it was really funny because I was like totally guilty of projecting my own feelings and memories. Because she was talking about her grandmother, not knowing her super well because, they didn't see each other all the time. And then she moves in and, she has like all these needs. And I'm like, wow, that must have been a real bummer, because when you're a teenager, like just a psychopath.
Yeah.
And then it's just like, oh, like someone's coming in and like taking up like, all of this attention or whatever. And she's like, no, actually it was great because like, we were already used to taking care of people and we just recognized her needs. And I was like, wow, like I'm an asshole. And it's like, wow, that's really like, I was just projecting how I would have felt.
Right. I have to say that my mom would probably say that she was the biggest asshole teenager ever, because I was very outspoken and I always challenged authority and I always spoke my mind in a respectful way, but I was super sarcastic and I was super like, I would make adults think about why they were doing what they were doing, especially if it impacted me.
Yeah.
And so, but we grew up in a house. My mother's second husband was a quadriplegic. He suffered with multiple sclerosis for the entire life of their relationship. So we didn't know anything other than making sure that he was okay, his physical needs, right? And as he began to deteriorate from the cane to the one that's attached to the arm, to the walker, to the wheelchair, all of those things, we made sure that his needs were met. But my sister and my mom are very much alike. They were like the caregiver that, okay, you have to take your meds at this time. Okay, it's time to eat, that kind of thing. Whereas I was the caregiver that was like, okay, I'm going to the doctor with you and I'm asking 100 questions because we want to make sure that you're doing right by, him. Or if we were out in public and a little kid was staring, I would be that caregiver would be like, he can talk. It's okay. He's human too. This is a wheelchair, so my sarcasm would really, really kick in. And so I knew no other world than to help folks. And because of him, we always had individuals in our home who had challenged disabilities and, or abilities, as we say now. But he was like the most brilliant, conversationalist. He can hold a conversation with anyone. And he was the smart. When I would have my down moments, that's who I go to and say, "Hey, Papa, can you tell me your opinion?" And we would have the greatest conversations. And we honor him. And my kids look at him as one of their grandparents. And he is definitely a missing piece to our puzzle, but he's still part of our existence.
I
love that.
He's still alive.
No, he passed 10 years ago now.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So my youngest doesn't know him, but he has so many stories because all of the other grandkids make sure that he knows he knows who Papa was.
See, stories from grandparents. It's a thing. They'll have to come on and talk about him.
Yeah. Oh, they should.
Yeah. That's amazing.
Absolutely.
How was it for your mom seeing her mother with dementia?
Ooh, I really think that it was extremely hard for her. When she came to live with us, the first couple of things that I would tell my mom was, "Man, you guys look alike. You look so much alike." And so I got to see what my mother would look like as she progressively gotten older. Like, "You look like your mother so much." And she would deny. She'd be like, "No, I don't look like Gladys." But I think that because it was dementia and not just the cancer, which is like pain management sometimes, and not necessarily the mental connection or disconnection. And I know that the type of mother and type of person that my mom is, it was easy for her to put little tasks that required conversation off on my sister and I, so that she didn't have to feel like her mother didn't know her. And so then we would relay the stories that, Grandma Gladys called us Kim, or called us. She had a cousin named Carolyn, and she'd be like, Care, come here. And I'd be like, "My name is Sonia." And, even though I would say that 15 times, she would be like, "Come and brush my hair." I brush her hair and I'd be like, "My name is Sonia." And she never got my name. But my mom I don't think that she had the capacity to know that her mother just was at this place where she didn't recognize folks. And so we would tell her, and then my mother would relay to us the stories of who these individuals were. So it almost was like my mom was able to speak for her mother and tell her history and tell her family story. But because it was so painful, and she knew that if she entered that room, she probably wouldn't recognize her too. That was the hard part. So she would distance herself, and she would tell us, my sister and I, "Go and hang out with your grandmother. Go play cards. She likes pinochle." I learned how to play pinochle from an elderly dementia suffering woman who couldn't say my name ever, but she knew how to whoop me in pinochle.
That sounds like such an old person game.
Yeah,
it is.
Yeah.
It's also a really fun word to say.
And it was always funny. It was always fun. She never heard us. She did throw a brush at my sister once, but
she never heard us. Just my sister.
She never heard us. But it was fun. It was humorous. It was like I had stories to go to school the next day and tell my friends, to be like, "Let me tell you what my grandmother did today. Let me tell you what she said," like those kind of things. And I was, like I said, I was the one who couldn't take care of like the physical things. So if my papa or my grandmother were to poop or vomit or things like, I could, I'm not your girl. But all of the other stuff, I'm your girl. Does that look good on you, Granny? Yes. Let me doll you up and make you look good today. Let's put some lipstick on it. All those kind of things. But we had a good balance, and it was eye-opening very much to watch her transcend.
Yeah, absolutely.
In addition to being a mother and, grandmother figure to many people, you had mentioned that you wear lots of different hats. And I was hoping that we could talk about some of the other work that you do, because you work a lot in anti-racism, right? What kind of stuff are you working on?
Yeah, it's such an interesting journey. My mother tells me, when you talk about the work that you do, never forget 7-year-old Sonia. 7-year-old Sonia arrived at her school one day after overhearing her parents having a conversation about a cousin who was mentally challenged, who had the mental capacity of probably a 7, maybe a 10-year-old, but was this beautiful 6'4" giant and just liked to smile and giggle and play with us kids. And I loved my cousin Carl. And I overheard my father telling my mom that the police had killed him. And I was like, Carl wouldn't hurt he wouldn't hurt a fly. And the way I overheard the story was that he had locked himself out of the house. He was taking the trash out. And he locked himself out of the house, and he was knelt down by the stairs of my aunt's front porch, crying because he couldn't get in the house. And he was only in his underwear. And the neighbor called the police because she didn't know what else to do. But the neighbor told the police, he's harmless. He has mental health challenges. He will not hurt anyone. I know that he has to be in some kind of trouble, but I don't know how to help him, and he won't stop crying. And so the police arrived, and he got scared, and he started walking down the middle of the street, and they called his name, and he didn't respond. And so they shot him in the middle of the street, and he was killed. God. And I was 7, and I'm overhearing this story, and I go to sleep that night. I really don't think that I slept. I probably bawled my eyes out all that night. And I went to school the next day, and the only thing that I could think to do was not stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. So in our Pledge of Allegiance here in America, the last line says liberty and justice for all. And I just, even at 7, I knew that something was wrong with saying that. And so I said, that doesn't happen for people who look like, us in our community, because I see the police come into our community often, and it doesn't end up looking like that felt good, right? Mm-hmm. And again, I was just 7. And so I knew early on that I was, or my mom would say she knew very early on that I would be someone who would push the envelope, and that I would, challenge folks to think. And so I've always lived in this way about myself of, what does equity look like for us? Now, girls and boys will never be equal. But what does equity look like? Now, let's have that conversation. Mm-hmm. What does fairness look like? What does justice look like? Like, fill in the gaps where school sites are not meeting the needs of students. And that has bubbled into what now is Ascribe Educational Consulting. I do a lot of work at the university level. Unfortunately, because of George Floyd and what happened during the pandemic, all of those things, all of those gaps in systems here in America, we began to look at from a different lens. And so now I do a lot of work in corporate spaces when it comes to anti-racism, nonprofit spaces. Part of that equity piece for me is very personal. I look at my parents and why they migrated to where they migrated to. I look at my grandparents and how they were forced to still pick cotton and pick tobacco even after emancipation. And my mother's parents, who were forced out of their home because of the building of a freeway system. I look at those things and I say equity at its core is fighting for the most disenfranchised. And so my job, I also consider myself a debt collector, and I'm here to collect all of the things that my ancestors were denied based on their race and class. Mm-hmm. And so if we look at it from that perspective, if you feel the needs of those people, you'll be feeling the needs of everyone. So that's kind of what I do in a nutshell.
One thing that I think is really amazing about you, Sonia, is that you've been an advocate really your whole life.
Yeah.
If you think about it, like from, when you were just a kid and throughout and in so many different ways. And
yeah.
And you do like, not to, take the words right out of your mouth, but I think that you do approach everything with such grace. And one thing I wanted to talk to you about or hear more about is you've written a book about based on one of your experiences. And I was wondering if you could talk to us about that.
So I took 7-year-old Sonia's experience and I put it into a book. And It has dual audiences. It's definitely to teach kids that your voice is important and to be courageous in what your gut tells you is right, when even if the world and the adults around you say, shh, you don't need to speak because you don't know any better, or you don't know that, which adults oftentimes do to children. But it's also for adults to help them understand the voice of children is what changed the world. We wouldn't have the civil rights movement that we had in America had it not been for young people. There were elementary to high school kids who were getting arrested by the droves following Dr. King, right? So these were kids who were saying, no, my parents are too scared to get arrested because they are worried about providing for us and losing their jobs and all of the things, getting their houses burnt down. So arrest me. Imagine, I could have seen, knowing what I know, what 7-year-old Sonia did in the face of challenging the Pledge of Allegiance. I would have been one of those kids. Arrest me. And so I think that we get caught up too often with these pretenses of what it means to be an adult and a child. And so we allow for the pretense to quiet our children. There's not a day that goes by that I don't think of 7-year-old Sonia. She teaches me so much. In times that I doubt myself, I say, what would she do? She was the most courageous because Miss Bilyeu punished her to no end. I mean, like I can see 7-year-old Sonia looking up at Miss Bilyeu with her cat eye glasses, and it had the little chain hanging down from the glasses. She had her hair up in a bun, and it was these curled buns. So it wasn't just up in a bun. It was all these little so she had to spend meticulous amount of time putting herself, and she had this red lipstick that wasn't a bright red, but it was a soft muted, and she would pucker her lip every time she went to. So there are things that I can still see and feel and smell about Miss Bilyeu in her classroom. Miss Bilyeu wasn't all bad, but she was mean as hell to me, and she punished me to no end. I would come home with chalk stains all over my body and my clothes because she would make me on my recesses write on the chalkboard for an entire month. I'm going to say the entire month for a 7-year-old. I didn't have a recess or a lunch break. And when my principal found out that I was being punished like this, she came to my rescue. And Miss Reno was very progressive and hippie. And she said, hey, come into my office. Tell me why. She wanted to know why I had come to this conclusion. And she said, you know what? That makes sense to me. I can understand why you would not want to say the Pledge of Allegiance. She said, but also, I'm going to have to call your mom. And my mom was one of those kind of moms because of the racial and social and economic dynamics that we lived in America in the 70s. She was like, one thing you don't do is have the school come calling me, making it seem like I'm not a fit parent. And so when she got that call, she came to the school. Miss Reno explained to her what information she had. Miss Bilyeu came in and she said, I'm just so disgusted. One of the things that I still take away as 7-year-old Sonia, and I didn't know that it was bad back then. Miss Bilyeu said to me, I thought you were one of the good ones. I thought you were one of the smart ones. And so at that age, that wasn't my worry. That wasn't my problem. My problem was that I was trying to get on the playground for recess. I didn't know what that meant. As I got older, I knew what that meant. But my mom, she was she's my shero because she stood in that moment and she said, I don't know if this sounds wrong to you, but she sounds very right to me, speaking of me, and I'm going to fight for her. And that was it. And I knew, I was like, I'm off. I felt like I had gotten the get out of jail free card. I had lived through the torture of a month of punishments that maybe I didn't have to had I just gone home and told my mom. But I was
you
so
kept
scared.
it to yourself.
I kept it.
Oh my gosh.
I kept it. I was not telling because I was a very literal, verbatim kind of kid. When if you bring these people to our house, they're gonna make us look like this.
Yeah.
And so that was the fear that she lived in based on her birth and circumstance.
So did you refuse to say it every day?
Every day.
Wow.
Every day. And
that's
Miss Bilyeu
amazing.
Miss
I thought it was
Williams,
once.
go to the chalkboard. Not once. And at the end of this experience, that school year, Miss Billieu retired. And when I graduated 6th grade, Miss Reno introduced me. I was the valedictorian of my 6th grade class. And I had forgotten all about this. I had put it out of my mind. And she introduced me up to the podium to give the graduation speak. And she says, this little girl probably doesn't know how powerful she is, but I remember her telling me X, Y, and Z. And she made a person retire. That's power.
Yeah.
And I had completely forgot that Miss Billieu retired that year. And all of the teachers who were around at that time said it was because of you. She retired because no one, wants to. Miss Billieu would never say that.
What's the name of your book?
It is called Monsters and Aliens. And so here's the thing. I think that monsters become racist and aliens just land and they are trying to incorporate themselves into the dynamics of things. And so as a kid, I used to call myself an alien. And when I look up at Miss Billieu, and so I'm waiting on my illustrator to get that image right, because I'm looking up and it's a woman. You can tell that it's a woman, but she's a monster. And so I'm just looking up
Whoa.
monsters and aliens.
So it's a kid's book.
It's a kid's book. I want it to be very kid friendly.
I wanted to circle back to a conversation Steph and I had last night about how we have these conversations with family, because this can be really touchy and there's a lot going on. Like in Canada, I don't know if you know about the residential school system. So there was children who were systematically removed from the mid 1800s up until actually even sometimes the 90s in some areas of Canada, the children of Indigenous people. They are now recovering hundreds and hundreds of bodies outside these schools. And there's a lot of heated conversations coming up in families. And I'm wondering, how do we have these conversations with family? How do we have these conversations with an older generation that I don't know, not to stereotype, because there's obviously a lot of progressive and open-minded grandparents out there. But stereotypically, those conversations can be harder with an older generation.
They are extremely hard. And I think that the older we get, the more set in our ways we get. But I truly believe the old adage, you can teach an old dog new tricks. I believe that to the core of me. And so I look at it like this, we have to make decisions about who we want around ourselves. And specifically, if we have children, who we want to influence and impact our children. And so we have to make choices. And so I tell people, especially around the holidays, when you are with family, to think about 3 things. 1, essential workers typically don't get the holidays off. And so be kind to those folks who don't have the holidays off. If you do have the holidays off, it doesn't mean that you're subscribing to the narrative that some folks consider very false and very hurtful to who Indigenous folks are and to who here in this country, who Black folks are when we're talking about who built this country, right? And so having those conversations about race and class and gender are always going to be a challenge as long as individuals are closed-minded. And so I approach it in a sense of test, get a barometer test of the folks that are in the room. And if you have that uncle or that grandparent who is just very stuck in their ways, be able to establish your boundaries, but you have to know what they are, right? You have to be able to say, for me and mine, I would appreciate if you don't do this. And that's not to say that I need for you to change, but I need for you to understand if you're around me and my children, you can't do X, Y, and Z. And people either will receive that in a way of tell me more, and they're interested in your position and your perspective, or they're okay, I know where to put you in a box and I know what not to do around you, or you won't be, in our company. And then finally, when we have these conversations, just be very, very secure in where you are as on the perimeter, the spectrum of privilege. Because if you are someone who benefits from privilege based on how society is structured and the ancestors that you have, use that to the advantage of someone who does not have that same privilege. So like I said, I tell three things. There are people who are not going to have these holidays off, and so be kind to them and recognize your privilege. 2, know what your boundaries and expectations are so that you can say to people and be strong in that, be convicted in that. So you can say to people, this is what I expect and don't expect. And then thirdly, just be able to engage in a way that doesn't put people off, but it just sets you up for an open conversation, right? And so
see that third one, that's the tough one, hey? You've got to be aware when people are looking for an argument with this stuff. But I think to point number 2, knowing your boundaries is like that's I think the most important thing, and being secure in that, and that like you can display what's acceptable to you and not have to, like, I'm not trying to convince you. I'm not like here to argue with you and change your mind, but this is what's acceptable in my presence, please. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think being very resound in that, it takes practice. So if you have to look yourself in the mirror and, give yourself that ego boost, or be that cheerleader that you need to be for yourself in those moments. Give yourself grace. Like no one is perfect. And I use this analogy often. I saw a meme not too long ago that explained it when we're talking about race. I mean, I know that in Canada the structure of race and power dynamics is a little bit different, but it's the same colonialism, it's the same imperialism that has impacted America. We had the Catholic Church, the missions. We had the missions in California, very much like the schools that Indigenous folks were herded off to in Canada. Very similar. And so I tell people, I saw this meme, and the meme said the very great grandparents and grandparents who were throwing rocks at Ruby Bridges at age 5 when she was trying to go to school are the same grandparents and great grandparents who don't want their grandchildren and great grandchildren to know it was them throwing rocks at Ruby Bridges while she was trying to go to school. And so when you think about it from that perspective, it takes you, Robin, you, Steph, out of the equation of what the system was that forced grandma or great grandma to be throwing rocks at Ruby Bridges, right? But it doesn't remove you from the fact that now you know, and when you know better, you do better. The expectation is there that you elevate. And then secondly, is that when you know that something wrong has happened in community, that you address it and not be like America and sweep it under the rug and let it go 400 years and not even attempt to make whole those things that have devastated communities and still to this day devastate communities. So that's the piece. It's connecting those two things.
Yeah, I know. And then when it comes to grandparents, and it's like, how much do we hold on to this whole judge people for the time they're in or from, is that a saying? Judge people from the time they're from, because I feel like it's, where I'm more tolerant of comments that I would not be tolerant of from an older generation. Right. And I just you're old. You're this is what you were taught. And I think it's good to hear you say that meme, or hear you say that it's they were a product of that system too.
Absolutely.
Although they were not the victims of it, they were a product of it. And
we all were, right? Yeah. We've all played a role in the complicity and the perpetuation of racism across the globe. We've all, because of the dynamics and the structure of the system, we've all been charged to play a role.
This is something I've talked to both of you about, but I guess the listeners don't know, so you'll have to, pretend like you're hearing it for the first time, I guess. But yeah, so my grandfather was a family man. He was a very loving man in his own way. I just remember him doing very silly things, but he just loved talking about politics. And but it's funny because he also had a subscription to the National Enquirer. But he never talked about it. He never talked about those things. But he always had I don't even know if I ever saw him reading it, but like he always had the National Enquirer, but he was so, I was going to say well read. I don't even know if he read books, but he just like, he knew everything about like, New Brunswick politics and whatever. But he would sometimes do these really silly things where he would be like reading the newspaper in his like big lazy boy chair, and he would like grab us with his toes. Like he had like a really powerful, like big toe. And so anyway, so he just like, fun things like that. And I just remember like really interesting, like political discussions that I had no interest in because I was a kid, but then I like started studying politics and it was like more interesting. And then, like, I guess I was in my undergrad and he started making like racist comments. And I was really affected by this, and in a way that like, I don't know, maybe it was like completely irrational. I felt very like surprised and also like very disappointed, because it wasn't just like ignorant things, like things like, oh, because he doesn't have an education or because he's from a rural area. It was very much, at the base of it, I wouldn't have used those terms at the time, but it was very like white supremacist, and they weren't like, I hesitate to even like give examples because people might think like, oh, well, that's nothing. But to me, it was something, and it was really disappointing. And unfortunately, it did affect the way that I saw him. And it affected our relationship in the last years of his life. And to the point where when he eventually passed away, I was living in South America at the time. And I didn't go to his funeral because, I was too far. But it meant that I wasn't very supportive to my father, who was grieving this loss. And then, I had a conversation with my uncle years later, and I told him about this, about how like, sometimes you can know something rationally, but like feel a different way irrationally. And I was having a hard time reconciling this. And I told him about how like, I just like let my feelings about his racism really cloud the way that I remembered him and my feelings towards him. And he was really upset by this. And he said, he was racist, but that was 10% of who he was, and there were reasons why he felt that way. You both alluded to like, being from a specific time and place. And, New Brunswick was super white. It was just like super white. It wasn't very multicultural, especially when he was growing up. And I guess he had some experiences that led him to certain beliefs, but I didn't give him, first of all, I didn't have the ability to have those conversations when I was that young. So I wasn't able to like question him about like why he felt certain ways. I just like, I let my own feelings, cloud, everything. And like Robin was saying, of using the and, but, like he was still a great man. He was very generous. He loved his family. He was a great cook. My grandmother was sick for a long time, and he took care of her. I doubt he ever complained. But yeah, and even as I'm saying this, I'm like still self-conscious about the fact that I'm like, oh, here I am, like a white woman centering my own feelings in a conversation about race, and it's hard to have these kinds of conversations, and especially when it's older people that you may or may not have for like a long time of, like, do you bother? And so I really love the approach that you gave, Sonia, because, it's not necessarily about trying to change their minds, but I think you need to have a willingness to engage and to, question a little bit. And a lot of it is, quite frankly, ignorance, in the sense that, if you grew up a certain kind of way and you've never met a person of a different culture, or let's say you've never met a queer person,
right?
Well, how are you going to know? And I will say that, the grandparents I have left are my stepmom's parents. And, some people can really surprise you, like they're very religious people, but they, had no problems when my cousin, started dating women, and like they've taken in her fiance, like just, no question, like they're very loving people, and they're, in their 80s and 90s, and maybe not something you would, and maybe my grandfather had a more open mind than I gave him credit for, but I was not able or unwilling to engage with that. Instead, I basically just like shut him out. And I have feelings about that. And I feel like it got in the way. And I feel like, a lot of us are learning and unlearning. And I love the idea of, not giving up on people and their capacity to change, even though they're old, but also, acknowledging maybe their ability to change at this point and like meet them where they're at.
Yeah. I equate it to this analogy. I use it in my trainings quite often. Think of it as a bus system, a bus route. The bus keeps going around that route. It switches out drivers. It keeps going around that same route. You might not be ready to get on the bus. Either you don't have the correct fare. Maybe you're running late. Maybe the bus is running late. There's certain reasons why you're not able to get on the bus. But once you're on and you know how to navigate getting on the bus, now you got to figure out how to get off, right? And it's the same kind of navigation. Is this my stop? Did I get close enough, right? Did I fall asleep on the bus? Did I miss my stop? All of those things. But just because you've arrived at a point doesn't mean that you've arrived knowing it all about that bus route, because you may have only taken a portion of that bus route. Maybe you didn't get, like I experienced one time riding the bus and went around the whole city because we missed our bus stop. We missed that stop. And my friend told me, well, it's going to come back to and it was like 2 hours later and we were in so much trouble. But think about, you're only taking a snippet of that trip. But the bus route is taking the entire route. And so we arrive when we arrive. We don't know some things when we arrive based on what our life experiences have been. And so birth and circumstance, I highly tell people to consider birth and circumstance. It's something that we, cannot predict. Like I don't know. I don't know what we never know what family we were born into. We're just born into that family, And so we have to roll, as my father would say, roll with the punches, right? Make lemonade out of lemons. But there's a part of that too of, do we wallow in the sourness of that existence or find something better? So I think we have to take the earnest and responsibility of what that other could potentially look like. I can remember meeting my husband, and I met one of his aunts. He lived in San Francisco at the time, and their entire family was there. And she had never ventured outside of the city. She had never crossed the Bay Bridge to the other side of the Bay Area, which is like 15 minutes away. And I'm like, you've never flown in an airplane. You've never rode a train. You've never crossed this bridge that's 5 minutes from your house. And I just was like, this is in my mind, being judgmental, because I had, my parents exposed me to things. I was like, this is some ass backward stuff. That's what was running in my mind. But then I got to talk to her and share. One of her friends rode the train across the bridge and didn't make it back. And so little things like that can cause fear and anticipation and anxiety. And we just never know what that thing is that holds somebody up. And so we have to extend grace to others if we want it to be extended to us. And we need to be the biggest givers of grace when it comes to ourselves, and not expect other people to be the biggest givers of grace. So
Well said.
Yeah.
Well said.
Yeah.
For sure. What do you want your grandkids to know about you? What's your legacy?
When my oldest grandgirl, she's the first one that I call grandgirl. And I told her, I said, you will walk in greatness. And she came to me probably when she was about 15, and she had never verbalized that she was queer. and that she liked girls. She never said it. And so she said, Nana, I think we need to talk to Papa and my mom about who I am. And I was like, what do you mean who you are? We know who you are. And she says, no, I think you know who I am, but I think they haven't accepted who I am. And I said, what does that look like to you? And she says, it looks like right now me standing behind you, peeking over your shoulder while you kind of like tell them, like this. And I'm like, that's not going to work for me. And she says, I said, so what does it make you feel like right now? And she said, it makes me feel like I can't be all of who I am. And I said, from this day forward, I want you to walk in all of who you are. And so to this day, this now 20, she's about to be 21, and she will come and she'll give me a kiss on the cheek. Thank you, babe. Thank you, Nana. Thank you. Because I'm walking in who I am. And so that's kind of what I want my grandchildren, when they come to me, to say, she will listen. I think that one of my superpowers, when people ask me, what's your super, I listen. And I repeat back. It's not, I don't want to listen for the sake of letting you do a vomit dump on me. Mm-hmm. And then let's move on. I want to listen to understand. And so she just reminds me, I'm so blessed that she is my first grand girl. Like when I have grandsons, they'll be just grandsons. They won't be grand, She is a grand girl. You will walk in greatness. I think that I pay that to my mother, because she wanted to make sure that I would be a woman of a certain, she didn't know what that was, but she just knew that her mother didn't have it, but her mother wanted it. And her mother, to the best of her ability, tried to give it, whatever that it is, to her. And so my mother knew that, she was the kind of mother who said, date as many men as you want and don't let nobody call you a hoe. Because girls get these labels on them that are not earned. And right. Even if you were a hoe, be the best hoe that you can be. Things like that. And I, in my mind, it was like, I get it, but people still judge you and there's a backlash. And so how do you, she was like, you're already doing it. So just keep doing it. And so that's, I think, what I want to impart to my grandchildren, especially my grandgirls. Like, you have to walk in greatness, and you are just as important as anyone else, and walk in that, the confidence. My dad would always tell me, don't be conceited, be confident. And so, yeah, that would be what I want my grandchildren to remember me as.
Thank you for listening to Stories from Grandparents. If you have any interest in submitting stories, or if you want to participate on the podcast, please send us an email at storiesfromgrandparentspodcast@gmail.com.
And don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. It really helps us out.